Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Finding Dory. As much as the original Finding Nemo is a very universal story that anyone can attach themselves to and relate to and understand very universally, Finding Dory is a lot more exact in its appeal. It's very exact in that it's very much following up another movie. I mean, the title of it's Finding Dory, which invokes, Finding Nemo. Obviously, most sequels just put a 2 at the end of it, so, it should probably get some creative points for the titling, but it still very much feels like a Pixar movie that's trying to be a Pixar movie, and even in that, a particular Pixar movie. It's literally kind of going by the beats of a previous Pixar film, almost like the typical sequel logic, where you're basically kind of telling the same movie, but in a slightly different way to have a sequel. And Finding Dory at least does that well, but it's still doing that, and it shows how good of a director Andrew Stanton is, that he can make something like this work as well as it does, but he's still kind of doing that hackneyed sequel thing where you're like, oh, of course this is what the sequel to Finding Nemo is like. It's exactly like something we've seen before. And maybe that's kind of the problem with Pixar in general, or the Pixar sequels, is that this studio that started out being this surprising animation studio that throughout most of the 2000s, or really from Toy Story to Toy Story 3, surprised us and entertained us and gave us all these things that we never thought an animation studio would do. They felt risky while also feeling very safe and blockbustery, and this isn't risky anymore at all. I mean, hell, it's Finding Dory, and while watching it, it makes me wonder, can they even do that again, and can a sequel like this even reach to the heights that they used to, and are they even trying or even interested in doing that, or are these sequels the best we were even going to get from them, and this is kind of artistically where they're at right now. Finding Dory takes place a year after the events of Finding Nemo, and Dory has been living with Marlin and Nemo next to the anemone, whatever, for this whole time, and as she helps Nemo at school and is the teacher's assistant that she kind of self-appoints herself, she starts to remember where her family is and decides she needs to go and find them, and goes across the ocean again with Marlin and Nemo helping her to find her family, figure out and remember what happened despite her short-term memory problems, winding up in a marine wildlife institute in California where fish are able to come and then are sent back into the wild so that she can hopefully find her parents and be reunited once again, as Marlin and Nemo help her as she helped Marlin find Nemo in the last film. Finding Dory is mainly about Dory and her quest to kind of figure out her past and remember her past, and that's kind of the better part of the movie, that whole storyline, and Dory becoming the main character rather than Marlin and Nemo. Her storyline kind of takes precedent, which is a good idea for the sequel. I mean, obviously, was Nemo going to get lost again? So you go through her trying to remember what happened to her and her past, and particularly the beginning, which isn't trying to do the same thing as the opening of Finding Nemo, but emotion-wise and what it's trying to do for the character is trying to do the exact same thing as the opening for Finding Nemo. I really like a lot of those parts. It can get into a lot of sequences where you really feel bad for her, and you really get the plight of her whole existence, is that she can't really remember anything and she has short-term memory problems, and how hard that is to live with something like that. It's not exactly just making fun of it as it kind of does in Finding Nemo. She's more of a supporting comic relief character. This really gets into the problems with having short-term memory loss and how hard it is to go throughout the world, and how she needs help from people to remind her of things so she doesn't get lost or confused, and why she got lost and confused and separated from her family. It does explain basically how her life went from her parents to when she runs into Marlin, which I thought was actually kind of interesting. And I like those sequences, and that kind of reminds me how good Pixar can be, especially when she's separated from them, and everything with the octopus, voiced by Ed O'Neill, and that octopus, or sectopus, I guess, is only has 7 tentacles. Those sequences were rather good, and I think if that was like the whole movie and we'd kind of forgotten about Marlin and Nemo, this probably would have been a much stronger film. But of course it is a sequel, and the Marlin and Nemo storyline very much feels like the kind of standard sequel stuff. It has large set pieces that shows that they have a much bigger budget and the studio has more faith in them or something, even though it's an animated film, so it doesn't really matter if they do those sort of things. And I guess they're trying to do a different kind of film, so they're not just going to have it be in the ocean, so they're trying to change things up. It almost felt like in that sequel way where they're really pushing to change things up. And the Marlin and Nemo storyline never was really as as good. There wasn't really a point to it, whereas in Finding Nemo, the Marlin and Nemo storylines have points to those arcs that help the story. The Marlin and Nemo separate storyline kind of says the same thing as it did before. I mean, it's like not really that even interesting, but the Dory storyline I think is particularly good, but it kind of shows the kind of problem with this film. And what works about this film is that it can still do the kind of interesting things that Pixar does, and it can still pull at your heartstrings, and it can still have the parts about how important family is and what constitutes a family, not just, you know, the people you're actually related to, but the people that are important to your life. And this film is really good at that and doing all the kind of typical hilarious, well-written Pixar type of things. But the Dory storyline I thought was really strong, actually. For being a very Hollywood sequel, it actually reminds me of how good those can be. When you get to these, you know, it's summertime, so we're seeing a lot of sequels, big budget Hollywood sequels, and you get kind of sick of that, but this kind of reminds me how much fun those can be and how, if they're actually well done, they can be really good. This isn't one that's breaking the mold, it's almost living in the mold and doing a really good job. It's like if you make a cookie and it perfectly is in that cookie cutter thing and you're like, feel really good that you got it perfectly within that. They put a lot of different kind of sprinkles and chocolate chips on top of it, but it's basically just very much within that world, and that it's taking so much from the real structure of Finding Nemo. This doesn't feel like Andrew Stanton's doing anything too drastically different. Certainly he's changed the kind of protagonist in it and he's doing interesting things with Dory, but he's almost forgotten about Marlin and Nemo, so much so I kind of question why they're in it, other than, you know, this is the brand of Finding Nemo, so of course we have to have Marlin and Nemo. We can't have this movie without Marlin and Nemo, but their usefulness kind of wears off rather quickly. Most of what they're trying to say with their characters we got in the previous movie, so you're like, okay. I do like a lot of the newer characters, which I think added a lot to this movie. Obviously Finding Nemo is really known for its plethora of cool characters, and this film doesn't really overdo it with the cameos. All you get is like the seagulls really quickly and the sea turtle at the beginning, and then they kind of just let it become its own movie, but then they let it kind of go off on itself, so that's at least good. I mean, it's not too overdoing it with the nostalgia, it's just using the same structure. It feels very safe and what you'd really kind of expect a Finding Nemo sequel to be, especially for a big Hollywood type of movie. I mean, it's better than Monsters University, certainly, but I don't think it gets up to the height of the Toy Story sequels, because the Toy Story sequels are really trying to say something contextually about the toys, particularly Toy Story 3, and like kind of the arc of these toys and what these toys' lives could be like. And in Finding Nemo, it's kind of like, okay, well, let's do the same thing, and you're like, oh. Andrew Stanton, maybe I shouldn't bring up John Carter and say, you know, he had a pretty big failure and it fell right on his face, and he's come back to Pixar with his tail between his legs, despite what he's saying in interviews that this would have happened eventually anyway, but I doubt it. It feels like he's doing his safe movie to get back in good graces and get out of director's jail, and maybe that's true and he does a good job at that, but this really feels like Andrew Stanton, the once great Pixar auteur, has become the studio director who's doing everything the studio wants him to do, and that's kind of actually a little sad to see because of how his arc through his other three films like WALL-E and the original Finding Nemo, as broad and as mainstream and as big of blockbusters they were, you could tell there was a distinct vision behind it, and in this his distinct vision is trying to do his own distinct vision, and you're like, oh, okay. But I still had a lot of fun with this. I really did like Ed O'Neill's Sectopus, I think was good, and Ed O'Neill was quite good. I don't really like that Ty Burrell was in this, just because it's like, how many cast members from Modern Family can we have in this? I think Ed O'Neill was like kind of perfect for this, but Ty Burrell, I wasn't really as into him in it, and it did feel like too many Modern Family people, felt like too direct for the family market. Although you also have Idris Elba and Dominic West playing these two sea lions, and of course they were on The Wire together, but honestly I didn't know Dominic West was in it, and they don't share that much screen time. Maybe I shouldn't complain about that while hailing another, but the sea lions are actually really funny. I really like the sea lions a lot. This film does understand how to get new characters into this. The whale shark, voiced by Caitlin Olsen of It's Always Sunny fame, is quite good, or even Eugene Levy and Diane Keaton as Dory's parents. They do have a plethora of new characters, which are actually a lot of fun. And this is a really fun movie, and it kind of shows that even when Pixar is basically doing Pixar, they're still really fucking good at it. I don't know very many animation studios, when this is kind of at their lower tier, it's still pretty damn good, and probably better than, I don't know, most things Blue Sky makes, to say the least, or definitely Illumination. I think the problem with Pixar is Pixar's own reputation, and you could say, you know, that's really not fair, but especially when you're dealing with the people who, you know, that direct directed and wrote the films that you're kind of judging this film against, and why they have that reputation in the first place. And when they themselves, who are now coming back to this, Andrew Stanton hasn't made a Pixar movie since WALL-E, which is 8 years ago, and has now come back to do Finding Dory, I think I can expect a better movie, and I should expect a better movie. I do think he does a lot more action sequences and set pieces that he wouldn't have done normally. I don't know if that's because of the John Carter experience. Most of them honestly were just excessive in that sequel way that's like, okay, I guess. But the one sequence with the squid was really thrilling and interesting and beautiful, and it showed like how good he can be at something like that. I don't know if this is really what I want Andrew Stanton to be doing. I think I have kind of really looked at the auteurs of Pixar, Pete Docter, Andrew Stanton, Brad Bird, and John Lasseter. I guess I will always overanalyzing their careers because I all think they're really all great directors, and they've all directed probably some of the greatest animated films of all time. Each one of them has at least one or two of those under their belt. So when they direct stuff like a sequel like this, I mean, it's probably better you get your kind of lesser artistic tendencies out on a sequel and make an original property that sucks. So maybe that's good. They might be better at acting and story and character in some regard, and that's probably why the sequel works as well as it does. Particularly at the end, it felt like a big sequel set piece. You know, this didn't feel that original. And for people who are so interested in story and character, it almost felt like they didn't really understand the story as well. They just kind of fell into it in the typical Hollywood way that you expect, but just Pixar doing that, and so that's a better result. So you can kind of go, oh, okay, it's fine for now. But you know, when you see this on DVD, you're not going to love this as much as Finding Nemo. You're not going to love this as much as the great Pixar films, and maybe that is asking too much. And when it comes to something like The Good Dinosaur, I would say that, but last year we got Inside Out, and that was by Pete Docter, and this is Andrew Stanton, and it's like, dude, you have like 2 Oscars, you have all this reputation, we were all rooting for you, you had all this stuff going for you, and you're this great storyteller, and you come back with this, and it feels like very much as he's saying, I didn't limp back after his failure, this film in its direction feels like that. It feels like he put his all into limping. He's the great Andrew Stanton, he's this great auteur, and this is what I expect from him. A typical Hollywood sequel kind of cash-in. Okay, fine, you like did this well, but I'm just not really as enthralled with this. Maybe it's my fault for seeing Finding Nemo so close to seeing Finding Dory, but I think when looking at Finding Dory, although those Dory storylines really work and are really fantastic, and Ellen DeGeneres does a very amazing job. It's probably the best acting I've ever heard from Ellen DeGeneres in a voice role or anything in general. I don't like follow her career that well, but I was actually really into her performance. And for a character that can start off as really funny and get really annoying, they really knew how to get that character to work throughout the film. I wasn't sick of Dory after a while. I really loved Dory, and I really loved that storyline, and I wanted to see more. They made that storyline fascinating. This film does have things going for it, and it's a really good time, and if you want to see a great entertaining Pixar movie, this is it. You'll have a good time. You'll have a good time at Finding Dory, but it's not the film that's going to make you think of all these great emotions. It's not the film that's really going to touch your soul as much. It does some interesting things, particularly when she gets lost, particularly about short-term memory, that are very nuanced and interesting, and kind of gives you glimpses of that great Pixar, but it's only glimpses and reminders of a past gone era, and it's starting to make me think that maybe there's certain times that can come back. The great Pixar movies are becoming fewer and far in between for these sequels and lesser efforts, and it's getting a little tiresome, and I guess that's kind of par for the course for them. But if they're going to do that, I'd like them to be maybe a little more creative, because going on the exact beats of Finding Nemo and just not doing them as well springs to mind the whole problem with them doing sequels is that it's just not as creative and different enough to really make me fall in love with Pixar and see them go after their true creative potential, and seeing them kind of just follow step by step, almost paint by numbers, to their own formula that they did 13 years before doesn't speak to that, and kind of just makes me see a fine, very fun, entertaining movie, but a fine, very entertaining, fun movie that reminds me what Pixar has left behind, and wishing we could go back to that and maybe remember that, just like Dory has forgotten and gotten into this mess in the first place. So if you have seen Finding Dory and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.